So oftentimes, when rabbis introduce the darshan, they can begin with a phrase, "This person is no stranger to the congregation." But since our darshan moved away a number of years ago, they have been a stranger to our congregation, which makes it a particularly sweet moment at this time to be able to welcome back to the Bima our congregant and our friend, Joel Meskin.
The Adat Ha'il is the concluding proverb of the Old Testament and is traditionally recited by husbands during the Friday evening blessings before the Sabbath meal. I estimate that over the past 31 years, I have recited the Adat Ha'il well over 1,000 times. Each of my children already know it by heart, and at the appropriate time, Eitan and Ari will say it to the woman of their choosing. I would tell you to test them at lunch, but I wouldn't want to embarrass them. Jason knows the significance of the Adat Ha'il, as we discussed it when he asked me for Caitlin's hand in marriage. So why am I reciting it this morning, other than to prove to my family that I can say it without reading it? Parshat Hukat, which we read this morning, is rich with many stories, many that most of us are very, very familiar with. Let's start with the laws of the red heifer. Daber el bnei Yisrael v'yikhu elecha para aduma temima. God commanded Moses and Aaron to have the people bring them a heifer. It must be completely red with no blemish, that is to be sacrificed. The ashes of this red heifer were to be used to purify the Israelites who became in contact with a corpse. The intriguing story has and continues to give some of the most intense analysis and debate amongst our commentators. Why red heifer? This is pretty rare. It is said that only 9 existed during the biblical times. Why without a blemish? This is even more rare. This raises issues of how we focus on holiness, the distinction between sacred and profane in our lives as Jews, and the exactitude that we place on ritual, both in the Torah and in our extensive rabbinic commentaries on the law. How about the story of Moses hitting the rock? This is another big story in this parsha. God commanded Moses, "Take the rod, gather the Adat together, you and Aaron your brother, and speak to the rock before their eyes, and it shall give forth water. and you shall bring forth them water out of the rock. So you shall give the congregation and the animals to be able to drink. Having raised 4 beautiful children, including their going through their teenage years, having worked with so many employees and clients over my lifetime as I have, this is something that I wonder on a daily basis. Why not just follow the simple instructions? Why make it harder than it has to be? I know that this has never happened to anyone else here. The defiance of God in front of all the people led to God banning Moses and Aaron, our major leaders of the Jewish people, from entering the promised land. This had to be devastating. Just think what it would do to a Barack Obama if he couldn't enter the promised land. The amount of commentary regarding this act of defiance has led to generations of discussion and debate. The copper snake on a stick, another very dramatic story in this parsha. I envision the movie Snakes on Planes, the pit where Indiana Jones, we all get very creepy when the pit of snakes. The poisonous snakes come and bite all the Israelites, basically for not believing in God. God has Moses put a copper snake on a stick high so the people of Israel will look up and look to God. They do this, and the people are cured. We also have Aaron's death. We witness Aaron's death in the parsha. Not only do we experience his death, all the people mourned his death for 30 days. We hear about his replacements and the subsequent continuity of his descendants. And then in Parsha Hukat, just by the way, in the middle of the second Aliyah, which we read this morning, Miriam dies. V'tamat sham Miriam v'tikaver sham. 5 words about Miriam. We've got the long story about the red heifer, we've got the copper snake, we've got Moses hitting the rock, and then we have 5 words about Miriam's death. There's no mourning. There's nothing about what she had done up to that point for Moses or the people. There's nothing about who would take her place. And maybe that's because those of us who have been married to an Eshet Hayil know that they basically are irreplaceable. I contend that there's a connection between the one, by the way, reference of Miriam's death and the Eshet Hayil, which I recited earlier. It should not go unnoticed that the reciting of the Eshet Hayil by husbands is not a commandment or a directive. It's a choice. It's not even in the form of a prayer. I contend that the voluntary aspect of the tradition is a significant part of the blessing in and of itself. Let's keep in mind the concept of keeping something for granted, for taking something for granted, or someone for granted. Where is the connection? In the Chukat, we see that Miriam's life ends. Here's a woman who was originally introduced to us in the Torah by saving Moses' life. She sets the stage for Pharaoh's daughter to find Moses. She goes to arrange for Moses' mother to take care of him. But for Miriam, we would not have Moses, arguably the most significant figure in our history. Yet 5 words about her death. For all intents and purposes, Miriam was part of the leadership team that included her brothers Moses and Aaron. Yet 5 words about her death. She played a prominent part and very visible role in the Exodus, in the desert wandering. She was a prophetess who played a significant role in Jewish biblical history, yet 5 words about her death. In fact, Rashi, one of our great commentators, acknowledged that Moses could not fail to appreciate Miriam's role in his life. As Rashi comments, Miriam's presence framed Moses' life. She guarded him at birth and exalted him at the Sea of Reeds. And when she died, he lost his poise and capacity to govern. What impact did the death of Miriam have on Moses? Rashi suggests a great deal. He suggests that the death of Miriam is why Moses intentionally disobeyed God's instructions by striking the rock in search of water, which resulted in one of the biggest consequences of his life, not being allowed to enter Israel. So what does this brief reference of the significant woman from our history in Parshat Hukat have to do with the husband's recitation of this proverb each Friday night before the Kiddush? In studying Eshet Hayil, as in studying other subjects in the Jewish universe, I found commentaries across the board. For each Jew, there's 6 opinions. Some focus on the Eshet Hayil, in fact, not being the wife or mother, but the Torah or God. Others liken the Eshet Hayil to the Torah or to the ultimate teacher being blessed by her children and praised by her husband. One midrash I came across compares prophets to women. Just as women is unashamed about demanding the needs of her children from her husband, so the prophets are unashamed to demand needs of Israel from God. In other words, the midrash claims that the essence of prophecy is the courage to intercede with God on behalf of Israel, a courage sprung of love and primarily identified with women. How often did Moses stay God's wrath at Israel's constant backsliding? Biblical prophecy is as much a part of defending Israel before God as it is about delivering God's will to Israel. With Miriam's death, Moses has lost his compassion, essential to rule and his role as an intercessor, according to the Midrash. One commentator has resonated very strongly with me. Focus on the Eshet Hayil as a teacher. The Eshet Hayil as wife and mother defines herself as a teacher, as one who ensures her household breathes Torah. The Eshet Hayil as Israel is a nation of teachers, where generation after generation, the connection between the people, the Torah, and God is kept strong and encouraged. Her children arise and laud her. Her husband arises and praises her. Rashi comments her children symbolize her students, and her husband means the Holy One, blessed is he. Her students recognize her wonderful virtues and express her appreciation for the impact that teaching has made on them. Other commentators focus on the Eshet Hayil looking back to Bereshit and the creation of woman by God. At the beginning, the proverb we recite that she does him good and not evil all the days of her life. How do we imagine a person so virtuous as to never cause someone harm? Is she an angel? This refers us to the unique capacity inherent in a wife. The Torah reveals God's miracle of a woman serving as a helpmate, opposite him. Only God, the great designer, could fashion a companion that serves also as an opposite. A man and his wife perfect each other through their differences. They were not made alike, women and people to themselves. Each has his or her own ways and attributes, and each is intended by God to serve as a test to the other. Each complements the other, so as each one can harmonize and develop his or her potential to the fullest in the service of God. Thus, even a contentious wife is a precious gift from heaven, meant as a test to the service of God. When we understand the benefits intended by God, even from the seemingly bad that occurs in the world, we realize that it is not bad at all. A challenge is good, for it helps elevate and perfect a person when he or she approaches life with the attitudes taught in the Torah. I'm not a scholar. I'm a pretty simple guy, aspiring in life to be a good husband, a good father. So why do I recite Eshet Hayil every week, just as Elaine and I bless our children? Sometimes it is just Elaine and me. Sometimes we have some or all of our kids. And sometimes, as last night, we are surrounded by friends and family, including our new family. Sometimes we have challenging weeks in our relationship, and sometimes we have challenging weeks to deal with the opportunities of life. Yet I stand with my arm around Elaine and we recite the Eshet Hayil. Over the past couple of months, I have been studying the Parsha. It finally came to me. When I was flying home from New York to Cleveland a few weeks ago, sitting alone in the back of the plane, listening to my iPod, watching out the window as you go west. It's nice because you have an elongated sunset. It hit me. What came to mind, for any of you who have seen scene in the movie Jerry Maguire. Tom Cruise walks in at the end. He's the hard-nosed sports agent, no holds barred. He's going in the door, and there's a group of women, divorcees, in a session that we won't use any adverbs or adjectives, what's going on. Renee Zellweger's on the other side, and he looks at her and says, "You complete me." It really made sense to me. Although Miriam was not Moses' wife, she did in the leadership of the Jewish people complete him, with Rashi acknowledging that impact that Moses when Miriam died. Commentators and scholars have come up with many reasons for the recitation of the Eshet Hayil by a husband. At the end of the day, with many other things, we do this, in my opinion, for two basic reasons. First, I find that no matter how disciplined we may be, or how in touch with things we may be or we may think we are, we perpetually are in a state where we take things around us for granted. Like in Parshat Hukat, which we read this morning, we focus on many tantalizing stories, but we barely touch on Miriam's death. This is the woman who arguably saved Judaism. We spend a great deal of time on the red heifer, but nothing on Miriam. As many of us attorneys like to say, but for Miriam, everything else would be moot. The reason the recitation of the Eshet Hayil is not a commandment is that if it were, we could easily take the recitation for granted, which would defeat the purpose of reciting the Eshet Hayil in the first place. The second reason we recite the Eshet Hayil, in my opinion, is to make sure we understand the holiness of the union between husband and wife. In our world of the profane, we need to interject sacredness whenever possible, which I do not believe is the natural instinct, at least for most of us men. Accordingly, as with many other things we take for granted, our Jewish tradition creates a ritual opportunity to help protect the sacredness of marriage, which in turn protects the family, which in turn protects our community. It is truly nice to be home here at Adat Ariel, especially with our simcha. A woman of valor who can find. Shabbat Shalom.